Welcome to STEM Talk.
STEM Talk. STEM Talk. STEM Talk. STEM Talk.
Welcome to STEM Talk, where we introduce you to fascinating people who passionately inhabit the scientific and technical frontiers of our society.
Hello, I am Morley Stone. Joining me to introduce today's podcast is the man behind the curtain, Dr. Ken Ford, IHMC's director and chairman of the Double Secret Selection Committee that selects all the guests who appear on STEM Talk.
Hello, Morley. Great to be here.
Today we have climatologist Dr. Judith Curry, Professor Emerita of Earth and Atmospheric Sciences at the Georgia Institute of Technology. Judy also is president of the Climate Forecast Application Network and the host of the blog Climate Etc., which you can find at judithcurry.com. Judy's blog provides a forum for climate researchers, academics, and technical experts from other fields as well as citizen scientists to discuss topics related to climate science and science policy. Her research interests include hurricanes, remote sensing, atmospheric modeling, polar climates, air-sea interactions, climate models, and the use of unmanned aerial vehicles for atmospheric research. Judy was a member of the National Research Council's Climate Research Committee and has published more than 180 scientific papers.
In recent years, Judy has become known in climate science circles as a contrarian for pointing out the uncertainties and the limitations of climate modeling. In 2017, she resigned from her tenured position at Georgia Tech, partly because of the poisonous nature of the scientific discussions around the topic of anthropogenic global warming.
Our interview with Judy followed the release of her book, Climate Change and Uncertainty, Rethinking Our Response. The book provides a framework for understanding and rethinking the climate change debate. The book also offers a new way to think about the climate change problem and the risks we are facing, as well as our response.
Before we get to our interview with Judy, we have some housekeeping to take care of. First, we really appreciate all of you who have subscribed to STEM Talk, and we are especially appreciative of all the wonderful 5-star reviews.
And as always, the Double Secret Selection Committee has been continually and carefully reviewing iTunes, Google, Stitcher, and other podcast apps for the wittiest and most lavishly praise-filled reviews to read on STEM Talk. If you hear your review read on STEM Talk, just contact us at stemtalk@ihmc.us to claim your official STEM Talk t-shirt.
Today, our winning review was posted by someone who goes by the moniker M. Watts. The review is titled, A Great Podcast Even for Science Dummies. The review reads, I have a Master's of Fine Arts in glass sculpture. In other words, zero science background. This podcast is amazing, even for a layperson without an iota of science or math like me. The interviews are on the cutting edge and refreshingly knowledge-based, and listening to the nuanced discussions gives me an opening to comprehend these important topics, like how exercise really does affect aging. No gimmicks, no sales, just in-depth discussions with people who work incredibly hard and are concerned about helping people live a long, healthy life. Thank you, M. Watts. And thank you to all of our other STEM Talk listeners who've helped make it such a great success. And now on to today's interview with Dr. Judith Curry.
STEM Talk. STEM Talk.
STEM Talk. STEM Talk. Judy, welcome to STEM Talk. You grew up in a suburb of Chicago. What were you like as a kid?
I was addicted to books. While I was socially outgoing and athletic, I was also a compulsive reader. Our community library was in a lovely old Victorian mansion, and I spent a lot of time there. At home, I read my dad's mystery novels and also even plodded through the encyclopedia.
Sounds like a great childhood. I understand your interest in science had a lot to do with a geologist who came to talk to you and a group of your classmates when you were in the 5th grade. Can you tell us about that?
I was part of a group of 5th and 6th grade students that were being exposed to advanced enrichment. Once a month, the school brought in a professional person to talk about their profession. One of these was a geologist who I remember very vividly. She was an older woman, looked like a librarian, wearing a cardigan sweater that looked like my father's. She had a wooden leg, believe it or not. She talked about the ice ages and the woolly mammoths and how we came to understand these things. She made a really big impression on me. I was just fascinated. And in hindsight, The fact that she was a woman was also very influential to me. This was in the 1960s, when careers for women were generally in nursing or as a school teacher. So it never occurred to me that a girl couldn't become a scientist.
So after that talk, I understand you immediately headed for a bookstore where you bought a geology picture book?
Well, I had received $15 for my birthday. So where was I going to spend this money? Well, the bookstore, of course. I spotted this book on geology, sort of a coffee table style book with lots of fabulous pictures and a very good text. I vividly remember opening the page to a picture of a cross section through a volcano. I thought, this is the stuff that I need to know. I pored over that book all through junior high.
After high school, you enrolled in Northern Illinois University. What led you to major in geography?
Well, I wanted to major in earth science, which was a joint program between the geology and geography departments. One of the introductory classes was meteorology. I had a great teacher for that course, plus it had more physics in it than the introductory geology course. So I changed my major to meteorology, which was housed within the geography department.
You graduated cum laude from Northern Illinois and then headed for Colorado State University in Fort Collins, but you left after just one quarter. Can you tell us about this?
Well, for graduate school, I definitely wanted to head out west to the mountains to experience all of that spectacular geology. So I decided on Colorado State University. A month before school started, my father was diagnosed with terminal cancer. My father encouraged me to go to Colorado, but as soon as I got there, I started working on figuring out a way to do my graduate work closer to home, and I was accepted at the University of Chicago.
So for your PhD thesis at the University of Chicago, you decided to research the role of radiative transfer in Arctic weather. Your decision to study the Arctic atmosphere and sea ice turned out to be very fortuitous, didn't it?
Well, the faculty member that accepted me into his research group at the University of Chicago was an expert in radiative transfer. However, I really wanted to do atmospheric dynamics, so I was looking for a research problem that combined dynamics with radiative transfer. The problem that I identified was the formation of wintertime cold air masses and high-pressure systems in the Arctic. This was a very interesting problem that integrated atmospheric dynamics with clouds, radiative transfer, and sea ice.
That certainly does sound like a tough and interesting problem, still relevant, in fact. Your time at the University of Chicago would have been, I think, in the late 70s and perhaps early 80s. And thinking back to that time, I remember that many in the media were passionately warning about a looming new ice age. For example, the Boston Globe reported on April 16, 1970, air pollution may obliterate the sun and cause a new ice age in the first third of the new century. In 1972, two Brown University geologists wrote a letter to President Nixon reporting that a conference of top-tier American and European investigators had concluded that a global deterioration of climate by order of magnitude larger than any hitherto experienced by civilized mankind is a very real possibility, and indeed may be due very soon. By the mid-70s, this was the consensus view of the major media outlets, including the Washington Post, The Guardian, Time magazine, among others. Finally, the always confident New York Times reported in 1978, "There is no end in sight to the cooling trend of the last 30 years. Now, it always amazes me that when considering amazingly complex systems, and climate is incredibly complex, that many are willing to evince certainty in their predictions when humility would be more appropriate." And I've just finished reading your new book, and it's wonderful. And I wonder if you could comment on what I've just said.
Well, there's clearly a lot that we didn't know back in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, and there's still a lot that we don't know now. In the late 80s and early 90s, the scientists I interacted with were fairly oblivious to the global warming issue. We regarded it as more of a political issue. In the early 90s, I was invited to be a member of a scientific working group of the World Climate Research Program. The general sentiment at the time among the international scientists that I interacted with was that the IPCC was a political exercise that had escaped the bounds of scientific knowledge and uncertainty. And of course, the media was just running wild with whatever they thought could draw attention.
Yes, and do you remember the earlier Times that I was talking about.
The earlier, no, I honestly paid very little attention to it. I would come across it and it wasn't something that we talked about at scientific meetings. It wasn't something that I was taught as a graduate student. It's just something that I was relatively oblivious to at the time.
Yeah, it was, cover story in Time magazine and front page in the New York Times that this.
I didn't read those things at the time.
Yeah. You're probably fortunate in that regard, but it was all about the coming winter, the permanent winter.
Oh, I know about it. In hindsight, I know all about it.
It was amazing.
But, now that information is so ubiquitous on the internet, we have a very different access to all that. But, I did not subscribe to those magazines or those newspapers, so I didn't really see it.
Now, in 1997, you and a group of scientists took a major field expedition to the Arctic to document feedback among the atmosphere, sea ice, and oceans. The expedition was called Sheba, or Surface Heat Budget of the Arctic Ocean, and set out to address discrepancies between observations and climate models. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, there's some interesting political context here. Following World War II, the U.S. Navy invested a lot of funds in Arctic Ocean and sea ice research to support submarine operations in the Arctic during the Cold War. Now, after the Cold War with the Soviet Union ended in 1989, the research funding from the Navy dried up. So these scientists who were researching Arctic Ocean and sea ice thought they could get some funding related to climate research. They contacted me and we put together a fascinating project that integrated the atmosphere, oceans, and sea ice. The climate model angle was actually a rather cynical ploy to get this funded. During the Sheba experiment, an icebreaker ship was frozen into the Arctic Ocean for an entire year. The ship provided a base and platform for a large number of international scientists to measure different aspects of this environment. I didn't make it out to the ship. Instead, I was in charge of the aircraft operations, which measured the atmosphere and also provided a larger scale context for the surface observations.
Things began to really change for you following the hurricane season of 2004. And as you probably know, that was a big one here in Pensacola. There were 14 named storms in the North Atlantic that year. 9 of those grew into hurricanes. And as I mentioned, here in Pensacola, we vividly remember that unfortunate year. Hurricane Ivan blew in and destroyed or severely damaged about 50% of the homes here. HMC's offices and labs had such significant damage, both from wind and flood, that most of the staff had to work remotely for quite a long time. That was a sort of a pivotal year in many ways. Could you talk about what changed for you after that year and the subsequent year, the year of Katrina?
Well, following the 2004 Atlantic hurricane season, there was a lot of hype about global warming increasing hurricane activity. My colleagues and I weren't buying it. We figured that if there was a signal from global warming, you would see this in the global hurricane data, not just the Atlantic data. So our team assembled all of the available hurricane data from different government agencies around the world, and we worked to create some sort of a homogeneous data set on global hurricanes. We found that the global number of hurricanes hadn't changed since 1970. But our most significant finding was that the percent of Category 4 and 5 hurricanes had almost doubled since 1970. Our paper was published 2 weeks following the devastation of the New Orleans from Hurricane Katrina, so you can imagine what kind of media attention we got.
I can indeed imagine. And right after Katrina, myself and some of the other members of the National Science Board were tasked to do a study on hurricanes and hurricane resilience, both the science of hurricanes, but also the societal resilience and how it could be increased. And it was took a lot of time and produced little useful benefit, though the report itself, I think, is a good piece of work. But you know how that goes with reports. This paper really, as you mentioned, generated a tremendous amount of media attention. Numerous fellow climatologists across the country championed this analysis, and of course the media loved it. However, you and your co-authors also received some relatively scathing attacks from critics who particularly took issue with some of the hurricane data that the analysis relied on. But rather than just dismissing your critics, you decided to engage with them. Imagine that. First, what made you pay attention to these critics, and what happened next?
Well, our paper was extremely polarizing, not just between global warming advocates and the skeptics, but also within the hurricane community. Some prominent hurricane scientists were very antagonistic towards us, and they regarded this issue as their turf. One prominent scientist was extremely hostile, and all of this conflict played out in the glare of the mainstream media. In the politicized climate arena, particularly with regards to the hockey stick temperature reconstructions, far too often the response is to attack your critics and not consider the substance of the criticism. Well, I took a different approach. I wrote an article on all this titled Mixing Politics and Science in Testing the Hypothesis that Global Warming was Causing an Increase in Intense Hurricanes. I went through all the substantive criticisms and provided evidence for and against. I concluded that there was a lot we didn't know, and I became fascinated by the climate dynamics of hurricanes, particularly the natural variability angle. But more significantly, I was developing some new ideas for making better hurricane forecasts beyond 5 days. These ideas were implemented into an operational forecast scheme during the 2007 hurricane season for a client in the petroleum sector. The insane 2004 and 2005 hurricane seasons also took a big toll on the petroleum industry. The hurricanes not only damaged offshore platforms, but they introduced crazy price spikes for oil and gas. So with longer range forecasts, the petroleum companies could better prepare to ensure a stable supply of oil and gas and to take advantage of price spikes and dips in natural gas prices to try to stabilize the prices.
Can you talk about how following 2005 and the hurricane paper, you became a vocal supporter of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, better known as the IPCC, and the concerns it was raising?
Well, at the time, when we published the paper, the message that we wanted to get out to policymakers was, look, you need to rebuild New Orleans. Don't just rebuild it for a Category 3 hurricane. You might be encountering a Category 4 or 5. So I thought that should be, in part of the discussion. But the media just picked up on the global warming angle. And for the first time, people thought, oh, wow, if 1 degree of warming can cause, more intense hurricanes, this is something we really need to worry about. And this whole issue of hurricanes and global warming became a focusing event for the whole global warming advocacy community. And, at the time, everybody was asking us about global warming, and, we weren't entirely comfortable talking about that. But we decided that the responsible thing to do was to support the IPCC consensus. And so that was a perspective that I had, during the period 2005 to 2008 or so.
And do you still think that the warming that we've experienced has caused a spike in intense hurricanes?
Maybe a small one. If it is, it's very difficult to discern from the background of natural climate variability. Right. So it's tough to untangle the natural climate variability and a signal from human-caused warming.
Yeah, and it's a relatively short time scale considering the time scales involved in climate and geologic processes.
Right.
Things really began to change for you following what became known as ClimateGate in 2009. The unauthorized release of emails from the Climatic Research Unit at the University of East Anglia revealed that some researchers were actually manipulating climate data to make it appear that the Earth was heating up dangerously. Can you talk about the impact these email exchanges had on you?
Okay. Following publication of my Mixing Science and Politics paper in 2006, I began engaging in the climate blogosphere, including skeptics blogs. I was doing this to hone my public communication skills, but also to better understand the arguments the skeptics were making. So when the links to the ClimateGate emails were posted on various skeptics blogs, I was appalled at what I was reading. The emails revealed that a number of IPCC authors had evaded Freedom of Information Act requests for data, had cherry-picked data, manipulated the peer review process, and downplayed uncertainty, and otherwise attempted to squash and discredit the skeptics. During this period, I was in close contact with Steve McIntyre, who is proprietor of the skeptic blog Climate Audit. Steve was prominently characterized as the villain in many of these emails. We were both concerned that the skeptics would overreact to the emails and that this would damage trust in science. I posted an essay on the Climate Audit blog that went viral entitled, "On the Credibility of Climate Research." My main points were that the climate scientists needed to do better at making their data publicly available and that they should be completely transparent about their methods. They should be honest about uncertainties and more respectful to scientists who were critical of their research. A big part of my reaction to events unfolding after ClimateGate was a concern that I had somehow been duped into substituting the judgments of the IPCC for my own in my public statements on climate change.
Although you agree that the Earth is warming and that human-generated greenhouse gases are playing a role, in 2010 you began to question the scientific consensus on global warming, as you're pointing out, and began to become skeptical of the climate modeling that the IPCC was producing. So before we talk about this continuing evolution of skepticism on your part, it might be good to give listeners a brief primer on climate modeling and just how complex it is.
Global models create a coarse-grained simulation of the Earth's climate system using computers. These models simulate the atmosphere, ocean, land surface, sea ice, and glaciers. The models use complex mathematical equations that can only be approximately solved on computers. Some of the equations in climate models are based on the laws of physics, such as Newton's laws of motion and the laws of thermodynamics. However, there are key processes in climate models that are approximated and not based on physical laws. Hence, there's a lot of tunable parameters in these climate models, including clouds. Global models are exceedingly complex and they utilize the largest and fastest computers that are available. These models are amazing tools for trying to understand how the global climate works. However, they're not fit for the purpose of making future predictions, simulating regional climates, or extreme weather and climate events.
So before we go into more detail about your skepticism and the groupthink that surrounds global warming, it might be good to talk about what we know with confidence. In your book, which we will discuss in more detail a little bit later, you list some incontrovertible facts about global warming. Would you quickly introduce them now?
Okay. The first one is that average global surface temperatures have overall increased since about 1860. Then the second one is that carbon dioxide has infrared emission spectra and thus acts to warm the planet. And the third one is humans have been adding CO2 to the atmosphere via emissions from burning fossil fuels.
You argue in your book that these facts, however, do not convey much about the most consequential issues associated with climate change. There are 4 key issues you address in the book, and I'd like you to walk us through each one by one. Your first argument is that these facts not tell us whether or to what extent CO2 and other human-caused emissions have dominated over natural climate variability as the cause of the recent warming. Can you elaborate on this?
Okay. First, there's substantial disagreement about how much warming to expect from increasing atmospheric CO2. According to the IPCC, there's a factor of 3 uncertainty in the climate sensitivity to doubling CO2. There's also substantial disagreement on how much the sun has warmed the climate in the second half of the 20th century, when there was a grand solar maximum. And finally, the IPCC hasn't adequately accounted for multi-decadal temperature variability associated with the large-scale ocean circulations.
Second, can you talk about your argument that we don't have a good handle on how much the climate can be expected to change over the 21st century?
Okay, climate models provide future scenarios of warming that are tied to scenarios of how much CO2 we emit. We now understand that many of these emission scenarios are too extreme and unrealistic. For its next assessment report, the IPCC is backing off from these extreme emission scenarios. And again, there's a factor of 3 uncertainty in the sensitivity of the climate to increasing CO2. Further, we're unable to predict solar variations, volcanic eruptions, and the multi-decadal oscillations. So there's a great deal of uncertainty in how the climate of the 21st century will play out. This is generally acknowledged by climate scientists, in spite of what you read in the media.
Your third point is that we don't agree on whether warming is actually dangerous. You note in the book that the issue of dangerous is an issue of societal values, about which science has little to say. Can you elaborate on this for a bit?
There's no truly objective way to determine whether warming is dangerous, or any threshold for dangerous warming, or how we should compare the risks from climate change with other risks. The temperature targets of 1.5 or 2 degrees that UN officials say define the threshold of danger are derived from politics, not from science. What we regard as risks from human-caused climate change are convoluted with natural weather and climate variability. Further, these risks are dominated by the societal vulnerabilities of developing countries and poorer populations. Communicators hoping to spur action on climate change emphasize the more immediate risks of severe weather events, such as hurricanes or floods, which have little, if anything, to do with global warming. Climate change risks are now being characterized by activists and UN officials as intolerable. However, there's widespread disagreement on how to characterize climate risks by different individuals and constituencies.
Your last point is that there is also widespread disagreement as to whether radically reducing emissions will really improve human well-being in the 21st century. Why is that?
Well, there's two issues here. For radically reducing emissions to make any sense in terms of the climate sensitivity of CO2 would need to be on the high end, and natural climate variability would need to be discounted. On the other hand, which I regard as more likely, if the climate sensitivity to increasing CO2 is on the low end and natural variability is dominant, then decreasing CO2 emissions won't have much of a noticeable effect. In my opinion, the worst possible scenario is that we're left to face extreme weather and climate impacts with a crippled energy system that drastically reduces our resilience to extreme weather events. And finally, there's an opportunity cost. Focusing only on climate change leads us to ignore the broader ecological problems associated with our impact on the planet. These ecological problems include land use, overfishing, pollution, and degradation of the Earth's surface from mining and waste.
That's a good point, Judy. The whole sort of environmental list of concerns that one used to hear in the 70s, 80s, 90s has sort of disappeared, and it's become one note all the time, climate.
You pointed out many of these issues in 2013 during testimony you gave to a House committee following President Obama's UN climate pledge. You argued that the climate community had worked for the previous 20 years to establish a scientific consensus on anthropogenic climate change. You added that you believe this consensus-building process had the perhaps unintended consequence of oversimplifying both the climate change problem and its solution, introducing biases into both the science and related decision-making processes. Can you expand on this?
There's a key difference between a scientific consensus versus a consensus of scientists. A scientific consensus reflects our long-standing knowledge base about a topic about which there is essentially no scientific disagreement, like the Earth orbits the Sun. On the other hand, a consensus of scientists represents a deliberate expression of collective judgment by a group of scientists on a poorly understood topic. This is often at the official request of a government or other organization. The IPCC has worked for the past several decades to establish a scientific consensus on human-caused climate change. As such, the IPCC consensus is a manufactured consensus arising from an intentional consensus-building process. In effect, the IPCC consensus is used as an appeal to authority in representing scientific results as the basis for urgent policymaking. To make matters worse, politicians and activists extend the scope of the climate consensus well beyond its scientific basis and without regard for the actual substance of the scientific consensus.
As you've stated earlier, you clearly understand and appreciate that human activities are indeed contributing to global warming, but sort of take exception with this dominant narrative that humans are largely responsible or that humans are causing all the warming. And I think you've done a good job in this discussion explaining that and explaining your position. So I appreciate that, and I think our listeners will appreciate the nuance, which is often lacking in these discussions.
Yes, I think climate sensitivity to carbon dioxide is on the low end, and that natural climate variability is important, particularly the solar indirect effects and the multi-decadal ocean oscillations.
STEM Talk is an educational service of the Florida Institute for Human and Machine Cognition, a not-for-profit research organization investigating a broad range of topics aimed at understanding and extending human cognition, locomotion, health span, resilience, and performance.
So following your testimony on Capitol Hill, NPR interviewed you for its show, All Things Considered. In that piece, NPR pointed out that you walk to work, drive a Prius, and that you're fanatic about turning lights off and keeping air conditioning high and heating low. Some of your critics might be surprised to learn that you go about your day minimizing your carbon footprint. So when did you decide to do this and why?
About a decade ago, when I made that statement, I was trying to figure out how difficult it would be for people to change their behavior to lessen their environmental impact. In a wider sense, what I'm personally doing relates to a broad environmental aesthetic. I like to think of living in harmony with nature and minimizing my own footprint on the planet. I'm also interested in the new technologies. My house has solar panels, a Tesla Powerwall, electric heat pump furnaces, electric hot water heaters, an induction stovetop, and an electric car. I'm liking all of these new technologies regardless of any impact on carbon emissions. However, implementing these new technologies was really expensive, and I don't doubt that better technologies will come along in the coming decades.
I read a story in preparation for this interview where you said that even if we went to net zero with our carbon footprint, we would barely notice. There are people who hold up this pre-industrial age as some sort of golden age for the climate. What are your thoughts on this?
Well, there's a lot of inertia in the climate system, particularly in the oceans and ice sheets. So if climate sensitivity is on the low end, like I think it is, it'll take a long time before we would notice any difference against the background of natural climate variability. The pre-industrial age is held up as some sort of Goldilocks climate. Well, it wasn't. The 17th and 18th centuries were during the Little Ice Age, which was the coldest period of the last millennium. Not only were winters extremely cold, but the period was characterized by extreme drought and famines.
You are critical of the doom and gloom crowd and have even been quoted as saying there is no climate change emergency. Of course, this has led to you being described as a contrarian and a dissident climatologist. Probably worse things than that, too. Can you elaborate a little bit on this?
Well, the rhetoric of climate emergency, climate crisis, and existential threat comes from politicians, activists, and the media. It does not come from the IPCC. This rhetoric is driven by associating every extreme weather event with fossil fuel emissions and warming. Even the IPCC finds little evidence that associates worsening extreme weather events with global warming. The IPCC reports to reasons for concern. They don't use the word crisis or emergency. I regard climate change as an ongoing predicament. Humans have always dealt with extreme weather and climate variations. We're dealing with it now and we'll deal with it in the future. Now, I was first characterized as a climate denier in 2011, associated with my criticisms of the behavior of the ClimateGate scientists, the IPCC, and the hockey stick. Nowadays, you don't have to do much to get called a denier. Even scientists who prefer nuclear power to wind and solar are now being called deniers.
Yes, and the use of that word, they use that word a lot now, and it's meant to sort of psychologically link in people's minds to Holocaust deniers and other sorts of things. It's not an accident that that term is used. In 2017, after something like 185 or 186 published journal articles in 2 books, you decided to resign your tenured position at Georgia Tech. In announcing your resignation, you said a deciding factor was that you no longer knew what to say to students and postdocs about how they should navigate, in your words, the craziness of the field of climate science. In your book's introduction, you expanded on this and wrote that as you drifted away from the mainstream narrative about climate change, academia increasingly felt like the wrong trousers for you. That's lovely language, by the way. Not many academics walk away from tenured positions, although I and many others actually at IHMC have done exactly that. Was it a hard decision for you, though, to resign?
Well, it wasn't hard at all, which is sort of surprising when I look back on this. After all, I'd been in school since I was 5 years old. Before 2010, I couldn't have imagined life outside the university. But by 2015, I saw the writing on the university wall in terms of consensus enforcement and cancel culture. I figured that if students wanted to succeed in the academic environment, that they probably shouldn't be listening to me, which is a sad indictment of the state of our universities.
It certainly is.
In a post you did about your resignation, you wrote, "Once you detach from the academic mindset, publishing on the internet makes much more sense, and the peer review you get on the technical blog is much more extensive. But peer review is not really the point. Provoking people to think in new ways about something is really the point. In other words, science is a process rather than a collective of decreed truths." Can you expand on that?
Yeah, many universities seem to have lost the plot in terms of being an environment where there's an open and honest exchange of ideas and space for disagreement and debate. After all, science is a process for continuously evaluating the evidence, challenging our assumptions, and critically reassessing our conclusions. In the 21st century, it makes much more sense to publish directly on the internet. Apart from bypassing the gatekeeping of journal editors with an agenda, the internet provides a venue for extensive feedback and a discussion of the research, as well as for posting your data and a detailed description of your methods. Publishing on the internet can speed up and enhance the progress of science. However, the academic ecosystem still insists on the gatekeeping of journal editorial review.
And particularly of late, I've noticed just really poor peer reviewing in many cases. You know, I edited a couple journals when I was a younger person, and I hope we did a better job. But I've just seen some remarkably poor reviewing. And as you said, if you publish in the right places online, you get a degree of review and scrutiny that I think is not common even in the best journals.
It's much more critical.
Very.
The doom and gloom climatologists are getting a lot of publicity right now because of the weather that we've been experiencing lately. There was a recent study in Nature Medicine that reported more than 61,000 people died during last summer's brutal heat wave in Europe. Here in the States, this past July was really hot in many parts of the country, especially down here in the Gulf Coast. You couldn't turn on the TV without seeing videos of raging flash floods taking out homes and bridges in New York and Vermont. And then we saw that blanket of wildfire smoke from Canada drift into the U.S. and cause some of the worst air quality in the world in the Midwest and the Northeast. There are climatologists who point to these disasters as proof that we have an emergency in terms of climate change. What's your response to that?
Well, in the 16th century, Europeans used to drown or burn witches because they blamed them for bad weather. The pagans were somewhat more rational, blaming the gods for bad weather. So how did we end up in the 21st century blaming bad weather on fossil fuel emissions? For the past 50 years, the global weather has been fairly benign. In the U.S., the weather was much worse in the 1930s. Even though the average temperature was cooler than present, heat waves, droughts, and even landfalling hurricanes in the 1930s were much worse than anything we've experienced in the 21st century. For any particular extreme weather event in a particular location, you can invariably find something worse in the early 20th century, or the 19th century, or the historical record, or paleoclimate proxies.
You frequently argue that policymakers haven't thought through the climate change. Yes, climate change is real, and there are negative aspects, but your argument is that common portrayals of crisis are unfounded. In the book, you mention a 2020 paper by Bjorn Lomborg. He points out that under the scenario set out under the IPCC, human welfare is likely to increase by 450% by the end of the 21st century. Climate damages, Lomborg writes in his paper, will reduce this welfare increase to 434%. I suspect that for people who only get their information about the world from the mainstream media, this will come as a total shock to them. But one of the most important points you make in the book is that policymakers could screw this up, especially if we destroy our energy infrastructure. I realize that's a long question, that you probably have a long answer to go with it, but that's okay, because this is a critical point of the book.
So policymakers are assuming that we owe our descendants a stable climate. Well, we have no such moral obligation. Even if we would like to provide a stable climate, humans can't control the climate, not even witches. Think about this. The year 2100 is 77 years from now. 77 years ago was 1946, just after the end of World War II. We're now much better off than they were in the 1940s. Near the end of World War II, it would have been difficult to imagine the existence of the European Union, the rise of China as a superpower, a global population of 8 billion that is far less impacted by hunger and poverty, and also globalization. It would have been equally difficult to imagine the incredible technological developments and major social changes. And from the perspective in 1944, it would seem astonishing that in 2022, the world's governments are preoccupied with human-caused climate change. We can't predict what the world of 2100 will be like. So what kind of legacy can we hope to leave our descendants circa 2100? Well, we can hope to provide them with a culture of freedom and prosperity. We aren't any more likely to understand the world circa 2100 than people in the 1940s were able to understand what the world is like now in the 2020s. So sacrificing the well-being of the current population by restricting energy access, particularly in Africa, seems neither moral nor just.
You certainly make that point in a very compelling fashion. Another key point you make is that even if we decide to transition to all wind and solar, we're going to need a lot of fossil fuels to do that. Could you talk about that a little?
Well, fossil fuels are needed to create the cement, steel, and fiberglass used for wind farms, and also the materials used in solar panels. Particularly for wind turbines, transportation of these colossally large systems also requires fossil fuels. Fossil fuels are used for the extensive mining of minerals required to build wind turbines and solar panels. But in spite of the need for more fossil fuels to support the energy transition, politicians are busy kneecapping the fossil fuel industry, which ironically is contributing to increased costs for wind and solar. Wind and solar provide asynchronous intermittent power. Utility-scale energy storage is in its infancy. Therefore, wind and solar farms need to be backed up with fossil fuel power plants in regions where there is an abundant hydropower. So basically, by promoting wind and solar, we're locking in natural gas as a backup fuel, which is fairly ironic. I don't think that's what the intent is, but that's the way it's playing out, and there's really no feasible way to have 100% wind and solar power.
Yes, and there's always the issue of what do you do with the no longer functional solar panels and particularly the blades on these huge wind turbines. It's become a problem. I was just in Wyoming and they had a huge pile of these blades they're trying to figure out what to do with.
Oh, yeah, we haven't figured out what to do with all that waste. And wind turbines need to be replaced about every 10 years. That's a lot of waste that we're talking about.
Usually there's a huge pile of dead birds underneath them as well.
Oh, geez. And worse yet, the offshore wind and the whale deaths on the Atlantic coast are just horrendous. You know, back in the old days, 1970s, save the whales was the mantra for the environmental movement. And now it's somehow okay to kill whales. I don't get it.
Yeah, it's like we were talking about earlier. All of the agenda for environmental improvement has got rolled up into a single oversimplified topic, and it's just one note now.
So that would argue that rather than obsessing about stopping CO2 emissions by 2050 or some other arbitrary date, you argue that we put more of our energy into figuring out how to address our vulnerability to hurricanes, floods, and wildfires. Is that essentially correct?
Well, I'm all in favor of developing new sources of energy that are abundant, reliable, cheap, and clean. Wind and solar simply don't fit the bill. We should use the 21st century to transition to a better energy infrastructure, independently of the fossil-fueled warming issue. At the same time, we need to work to reduce our vulnerability to extreme weather events. Extreme weather events have always occurred, are occurring now, and will occur in the future. Let's work to increase our resilience through improved infrastructure, better land use policies, better water management, and better emergency management protocols.
Well, this is probably a good time to talk in more detail about your book, which is titled Climate Uncertainty and Risk. It's quite comprehensive. You started work on the book during COVID-19 in 2020, so that means it took you only 3 years to write it and get it published. But it's such a deep and thoughtful book. I had a sense that you've been working on it since you were in the 5th grade, flipping through your geology picture book.
Well, my overall journey arguably started in the 5th grade, but my uncertainty and risk odyssey started in 2010 following ClimateGate. Since 2010, I've written over 1,000 blog posts related to these topics. I thought that with all this material that I've already written, that writing the book would be easy. Well, it wasn't easy, and I definitely burned a few brain cells in writing this book. The challenge was to synthesize this information into a logical narrative.
So as you just touched on, your blog, Climate, etc., helped you with the preparation of the book. When and why did you start the blog?
I started my blog, Climate, etc., in 2010 following ClimateGate. I wanted to discuss all those uncomfortable issues that the climate establishment was either ignoring or trying to hide. I also wanted a forum where people from across the political spectrum could discuss these issues. My blog grew to support a very interesting network of people from a range of different fields and perspectives.
Climate Uncertainty and Risk, again, the title of your book, as Morley mentioned, is a very ambitious book. It sets out to show how the narrow and politicized framing of the climate debate has resulted in an oversimplification of both the scientific problem and its potential solutions. The book isn't just about the climate debate, but isn't it also kind of a treatise on uncertainty and risk with climate as the example?
Yes, as the title implies, the main themes of the book are about uncertainty and risk. The book starts with describing how we have come to mischaracterize the problem of climate change, and these same problems, through politicization, these same issues are out there in a host of other issues, notably COVID-19.
Right.
Part 2 of the book explores the deep uncertainties of what we might be facing over the rest of the 21st century in terms of climate change and extreme weather events. A scenario approach, which is useful for many different problems, including pandemics. And part 3 focuses specifically on how we should approach thinking about complex systemic risks and how to respond given the deep uncertainties. So yes, there is a general way of thinking presented here for complex, uncertain, ambiguous societal problems.
Judy, you just referenced the different parts of your book, and I would urge our listeners who are interested in the science of climate change, you should really check out part 2 of Judy's book. You begin this section with a chapter entitled The Climate Change Uncertainty Monster. This section of the book really highlights what a beast of a problem we're facing in terms of climate change, doesn't it?
The climate uncertainty monster has an interesting genealogy. In 2010, following ClimateGate, I was speaking out about my concerns regarding the IPCC's treatment of uncertainty. I decided to focus my research on uncertainty in climate scientists, especially as related to the global climate models. This focus led me to the philosophy and social psychology of science. I came across a paper by Dutch social scientist Jeroen van der Slees titled Uncertainty as a Monster in the Science Policy Interface. Once I read that paper, I knew I had found my theme, and the climate science uncertainty monster was born.
And then later in this section, you have a chapter entitled Emissions and Temperature Targets. You begin this chapter with a quote from environmental scientist John Foley. It reads, "The first rule of climate chess is this. The board is bigger than we think and includes more than fossil fuels." So what else does the board include?
Well, John Foley made this statement with regards to the need to include land use, Agriculture, forests, and land degradation issues as a source of climate change and impacts. This chapter in my book further extends the climate chessboard to include natural climate variability and socioeconomic issues.
Toward the end of the book, you lay out some scenarios for a way forward in dealing with climate change. There are two papers you referred to that I particularly found interesting. One paper is titled, quote, Usable Climate Science is Adaptation Science, and the other is Small is Beautiful, Climate Change Science as if People Mattered. In the first paper, Adam Sobel of Columbia University writes that it is in the present historical moment, the only climate science that is truly usable is that which is oriented towards adaptation. He argues that current policies and politics are so far removed from what we need to do to avert dangerous climate change that scientific uncertainty is not a limiting factor on mitigation. He goes on to write about the implications this might have for climate science and climate scientists. Can you talk about why this paper resonated with you?
Well, in recent decades, climate science has focused on climate modeling in context of a global mitigation strategy to eliminate CO2 emissions. Even if mitigation is successful, it'll have little impact on the climate in the 21st century. By contrast, reducing our vulnerability to extreme weather events or adapting is something that we can do here and now that will have benefits to people here and now. It's much easier to get local agreement on a policy that has local benefits than it is to get global agreement on a global policy. Local adaptation will help us deal with adverse climate conditions in the near term as well as in the future. The global climate models are of no use for adaptation. Local climate variations are dominated by natural internal variability, which the global climate models don't simulate correctly. Climate science has much to contribute in supporting local adaptation efforts that are independent of the global climate models.
In the Small is Beautiful paper, Regina Rodrigues of Brazil's Department of Meteorology and Theodore Shepard of the University of Reading in the UK describe how there is a widely accepted gap between the production and use of climate information. They argue for a break with traditional climate research and methodology, which right now seems to take more of a top-down approach. Can you talk about the proposal for a more bottoms-up approach?
Well, the UN approach has characterized both the climate change problem and its solution as irreducibly global, the top-down approach. However, more meaningful solutions can be developed from a more bottom-up perspective, with local communities working to secure their common interests. We need to recognize that what has been cast as a global crisis is, for the most part, thousands of local vulnerability emergencies that are revealed by extreme weather events.
Well, this seems like a good place to talk about what you call wicked science. Anytime I see wicked anything, I think of New England. That's a term that's frequently used there.
And you do get a particular gleam in your eye when that comes up.
Yes, it's
too.
always quite wicked. And the last chapter of your book is titled Wicked Science for Wicked Times. What a great chapter. Now, I know you didn't come up with the term wicked science, but it is a term that you obviously like. So what is wicked science?
Well, wicked problems are complex societal problems that are characterized by deep uncertainties and also ambiguities in social values. Wicked science deals with the complexities and uncertainties using a multidisciplinary systems approach. Further, wicked science explicitly acknowledges the political dimensions of the wicked problems and works within the political context. I'm not talking about activist scientists who are political advocates. Rather, wicked scientists work with decision makers to help them understand the science and the full range of their policy options.
Judy, I must say the term wicked science resonates with me as well, and I certainly hope you continue your wicked and contrarian ways.
Yes, I love identifying as a wicked scientist. It's a perfect
really
descriptor
good.
of what I do.
Yeah, that would be a good thing on your bio or something,
Right.
Wicked scientist.
I think we're going to have to start adding that to our business cards, Ken.
Yeah.
So now that you've resigned from Georgia Tech and academic life, how are you spending your time?
Well, I'm working full-time for my company, Climate Forecast Applications Network, or CFAN for short. We founded this company in 2006 while still at Georgia Tech. CFAN provides weather and climate forecast information to help our clients manage their weather and climate-related risks. CFAN's clients are mainly in the insurance and energy sectors. I'm very busy this week with Hurricane Lee. I also remain active in engaging with the public on my blog and also Twitter.
You've also left Atlanta and moved to Reno, Nevada, where your daughter lives. I understand you enjoy spending time in the mountains overlooking Lake Tahoe with your dogs. Sounds rather idyllic. Well, Judy, this has been fun and enlightening interview. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you.
It was wonderful. Appreciate you coming on STEM Talk.
STEM Talk. STEM Talk. STEM Talk. STEM Talk.
Judy has certainly given us a lot to think about. Climate change and global warming are real, as Judy points out, and they are going to be with us for the rest of our futures. I appreciate her message today, and we need to learn how to best engage with the environment and support human well-being while also responding to climate change. And as she says, it won't be easy.
But humans have always done so. Judy resigned from her tenured position at Georgia Tech, in part because she no longer knew what to say to students and postdocs regarding how to navigate the craziness in the field of climate science. I admire that about Judy. She also makes a good point that research and funding for climate science and global warming has become highly politicized. The politicization of science is a trend that really concerns me. If you are interested in better understanding climate change, and particularly the substantial uncertainties associated with it, I encourage you to check out her book, Climate Change and Uncertainty.
If you enjoyed this interview as much as Ken and I did, we invite you to visit the STEM Talk webpage, where you can find the show notes for this and other episodes at stemtalk.us. This is Morley Stone signing off for now.
And this is Ken Ford saying goodbye until we meet again on STEM Talk.
Thank you for listening to STEM Talk. We want this podcast to be discovered by others, so please take a minute to go to iTunes to rate the podcast and perhaps even write a review. More information about this and other episodes can be found at our website, stemtalk.us. There, you can also find more information about the guests we interview.